Hi, I'm Terry Satterfield, and I am Professor of Culture, Risk, and the Environment at the University of British Columbia, where I teach and conduct research as part of the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. I'm also a member of the Environmental Decision Alliance, and I'm here today to present a webinar for the Alliance, and this one is references a study of supporting food sovereign decisions and a puzzle that was presented to us by the Namgis First Nation. So all the work reported here is in collaboration with them from the earliest stages of the research through to its uses in the present day. So I want to also offer a shout out to Leslie Robertson and Anton Pitts, who are crucial to this work, and to the Namgis First Nation as partners in this work, in particular Diane Jacobson, who is Namgis historian, who was involved in all stages. And finally to the Peter Wall Solutions Initiative, which helped fund this research and support the work of two student assistants, T. Lim and Jill Guerra. There are other pieces to this, a larger project that I'm not going to talk about today, which involved expert elicitations on climate signatures for different foods, but that I've done in collaboration with Shannon Hagerman, but I will leave that for another day. Okay. Well, every so often you get lucky enough to have a research puzzle come along, and this one came along quite literally in the form of a kitchen table conversation with some Namgis friends and colleagues. And we were talking about the state of climate research in the area and particular needs they might have in reference to climate change. And they said quite nicely and appropriately, frankly, we don't really think about climate change. We think about food, and we think about state of foods in the future, and we think about the possibility of becoming food sovereign. And so climate is always linked to thinking about food and the marine environment more broadly. So what they wanted to know was something quite straightforward, which was what would it take for us to become food sovereign in an era of climate change, and how should we think about that? And they really weren't especially interested in the academic definitions of food sovereignty that have become quite common, the good definitions, and they tend to speak mostly to food sovereignty as a function of rights, the right to fish for Aboriginal populations, the right to maintain and develop one's own capacity to produce what is considered basic foods, respecting cultural and productive diversity within one's territory, or for the Kwakwak, more specifically, it was really food in relation to marine resources, which is at the heart of their culture, not just a need or conforming to present legal understandings, but a whole series of practices that may or may not be doable for different reasons. So the Namgis live in the village of Alert Bay, which is just off the northeast end of Vancouver Island, which is that sort of pink island you can see at the bottom left-hand side of the map. They're on an island called Cormorant Island, which you get to from ferry from a port. Just below what you can see there is Port Hardy, fairly near the island. And on the left-hand side is the look of the island as you approach it by ferry. It's a lovely part of the province. So when we were talking to the Namgis about wanting to be food sovereign, we started with the usual questions that people doing work of this kind often ask, which is, what do people want to eat? Should we examine access in terms of how they are able to procure food or not, and through what governing and other mechanisms? Should we look at barriers to capacity, for instance, policy, land-based production capacity of the territorial space? And could we look at legal context or arguments for their case? They more or less rejected all of these questions. No, we really don't want to know what people want to eat. We really don't want to examine access. We know enough about this. We might find some investigations of barriers kind of useful. And frankly, we know our own legal rights and arguments. What they really wanted to know was not to ask people what they want, but that the diet should be traditional, or at least people should have that option. So to start there, what would it take to feed the population a traditional diet? And they also wanted to know how to think about what is traditional, which was an open question and a complicated one. And they wanted to know what it would take we could figure out a traditional diet, what it would take in harvestable foods and how doable was that and under what circumstances. And of course, that goes back to what's the diet that we're talking about. And they wanted to know, and if we couldn't meet that diet, what could we grow and what makes sense to grow here on the north end of the island, where it's quite a bit cooler than the south end of the island, where there's quite a lot of farming taking place. So it was an open question as to whether there really was an agroecology for the region or an agroeconomy for the region, that part of the province that we could rely on, and is it workable in this context? They also wanted to know very prosaic things. What was it all going to cost? And does it make sense? Like, should we be going to the grocery store? We know we need food for ceremonial purposes. We know we want as much salmon as we can have in people's freezers. But if we're going to really do a full diet, what might that look like? And what would it cost? In some sense, that meant a per unit cost of procuring versus growing food that we had to look at. But let's back up a little bit. Historically, food is a very contentious subject, first of all. I mean, it's at the heart of colonial dispossession of marine resources, as it is in much of the settler world. In Canada, this was realized by the Indian Act, a very brutal piece of legislation that essentially criminalized all food and harvesting practices for First Nations and really went to the heart of how they governed territory and who they were at the time. The colonial forces came to this part of British Columbia, and it went right down to very prosaic things, criminalizing and banning the use of all gear like traps, weirs, and spears. There was a hugely discriminatory licensing practice where, for instance, if you were a non-native fisher, you could get a license for $1, and if you were First Nation, you couldn't get a license at all. Access to sites was not just limited, but forbidden in a lot of cases, including very local food harvests. And it was also illegal to contest these abolition of rights in the first place. So you couldn't hire a lawyer to pursue your right to rights in the first place. So like so many parts of the world, this colonial history is very much alive and loud in people's discussions of food today, as it should be. There have been several legal definitions of Aboriginal rights to food in the Canadian context. The cases that people most often cite are Calder and Sparrow. Sparrow, for instance, all of these cases upheld the right to food and ceremonial fish, so upheld the right of people to fish in their territory. More recently, the probably most well-known cases are more about rights in general. Delgamuukw really asserted the right of First Nations to be involved in decision-making around resources in their territory. Among other aspects of that decision, the Chilcotin case was really the first time title and rights of use within that title were spatialized, although that remains uninterpreted in most of these cases. So the big debates are, how do we interpret these legal structures? You can look at them and say in face value that means rights, but as nations try to exercise those rights, it is much more difficult than you'd think. So moving on from that legal context, or Canadian legal context, how could we go after this puzzle? And the first part of the puzzle is really just figuring out these diets and figuring out what it would take in volume and resources to feed 1,000 people, which is more or less the number of people residing on Cormorant Island, give or take the comings and goings of people seasonally for work and other things. So in that first puzzle, we had to figure out, well, how could we think about what is historical? There is no documented by volume or load per person of a historical diet, but there is a pretty good record on foods that people have eaten historically. So historically, the ethnoecological record suggests that there's at least 120 foods that people harvested locally. And there's also a good archaeological record, which suggests that in this part of the country or in this part of the coast, they had a very high protein diet, a fair bit of fat in the diet, and a fairly low carbohydrate count in the diet. In fact, the traditional diet was about 5 to 10% carbohydrates, much higher in protein, and about the same in fat. So we just moved off that sort of perfectly traditional diet just because it seemed fairly inachievable with regard to um, carbohydrates and proteins. And so we raised the number of carbohydrates a little bit and lowered the proportion of protein a little bit. So this is a quasi-traditional diet as concerns the macronutrient evidence from the archaeological record. And we worked with about 2,000 calories a day. So it wasn't the 3,000 calories a day that is often recommended for children, or the 1,500 to 2,000 that's recommended for seniors. So in essence, what we're trying to say is we took a very conservative estimate of a 2,000 calorie diet a day, a fairly high, but not as high historically on proteins, carbohydrates and fats, or higher on carbohydrates, lower on proteins. The picture here, if you're wondering, is preparation of food for a feast in the big house, which I'll talk about in a minute. All right, so, I mean, you can't read this, but it's an archival snapshot of what we could find on different foods. So we could find what foods were eaten. That's how we discerned that there were about 120 foods eaten historically, which we then reduced to about 40 foods. And we reduced it to this list because it's what's still available, it's what people know how to harvest, it's what people regularly eat. So it seemed like a reasonable extension of a contemporary traditional diet without expecting people to relearn how to procure foods that had long moved out of the knowledge base locally because of different colonial practices. And that came down to a list that looks something like this, and we had to figure out how to express these lists in ways that people could look at and discuss. So for instance, for 1,000 people, we had a histogram like this one, which had the total volume by kilograms per year that it would take to feed 1,000 people. And in this one, we just had it in numbers of fish for 1,000 people, nearly 24,000 salmon, or 32 moose, or 83 elk, and so on. And this is just what we came to after many, many iterations of what seemed like a reasonable diet. And even then, it's far from perfect. So for instance, 83 elk per year for 1,000 people is still a lot of elk. It's a small portion of the total protein, but and elk aren't necessarily available every year in these kinds of numbers. In fact, in a bad year, they might get 8 elk tags or something for food fish. But it's still a lot. I mean, you're still looking at many, many crabs, many, many fish, lots of waterfowl in the form of goose and duck, and so on. But the diet that people really like to look at is, what did it mean per person? This they could relate to in particular because they could imagine what they had freezer space for, what they might can and shelve. So for instance, they might need about 30 fish per household per year, which isn't that many when you think about it. That's sockeye in particular. All fish comes back to sockeye to a certain extent in this part of the world, but chum and halibut and oolican and other fish as well. Or they might need something like 30 crabs per family, or 60 kilos of vegetables. So we just, again, work through these diets to express manifestations of them for 1,000 people and for one person, so people could kind of relate to the volumes that we derive. And there are paper versions of this if you want to look at the details. And then, without getting too materialist about this, just want to make a very clear point that food has lots of meanings, of course. It's not just about the caloric intake or volume that people need. So in the non-peace world, food is very central to a couple of fundamentally important ceremonial practices known as feasting and potlatching. And this is the place and the processes through which you could say all cultural business occurs. So it's the central institutions of governance, passing on names to future generations, to people who are taking responsibility for a dance or a song, or taking responsibility for territorial governance, for chiefly responsibilities of various kinds. So everything that is non-geese business in terms of territorial and social governance occurs through feasting and potlatching. And in essence, food is the currency for those moments. It's how you serve food to witness what's occurred at feasting and potlatches, to recognize their decisions being made in those fora, and recognizing people as witnesses to those decisions. And harvesting itself is also very important to Namgis because it's the means through which knowledge continuity occurs. So harvesting knowledge, distribution of that knowledge, expressions of band and territorial wealth happens through harvesting and harvesting knowledge, but it's also during harvesting that a lot of one's knowledge about the history of the land and the seascape is learned. So quite literally, clan histories are written on the land or the rivers or the intertidal territories. These are sites of oral history, sites of origin stories or cosmology stories that are told in place, often during harvesting activities or being in territory. But the Namgis are knowledge holders for this, so I don't want to go into it too much detail here, except to say that food has a lot of meanings aside from kilogram or dollar volumes. But back to the more prosaic aspects of this project, we didn't just estimate food needs for procuring an annual diet. We also looked at food needs for feasting and potlatch. So for instance, the last year that they had really good records for those ceremonial practices was 2013, where about 6,500 people, that's a lot of people, were served traditional foods over 13 days of ceremonial events. And those events could stem from a small event, say a wedding feast of 150 people, to a large potlatch that might feed 1,500 people over 1 or 2 days. Just to get a bit more of a feel for what that looked like in sort of volume flavor, you might serve nearly 4,000 sockeye over the ceremonial calendar in Alert Bay, or you might serve 4,500 pounds of elk or moose. So the sheer sort of production and importance of food at these events can't be underestimated, but just to give you a flavor for that. So the next big question became a Western diet, or what they referred to as a Western diet. And this was kind of doing a similar thing over many iterations to say, well, what might a diet that you could procure or produce locally or purchase locally look like? And so there we went back to things that people also eat and tried to distribute that across a slightly different configuration of carbohydrates, and fats and proteins, precisely because it might look like a Western diet might look a little closer to what the Canada Food Guide might look like for the region. So still quite heavy in fish because people on the West Coast eat a lot of fish, but nothing like the traditional diet. So instead of 30 sockeye, or 8 sockeye, or instead of elk, you might have somewhere between 35 and 40 kilos of beef a year, 20 kilos of chicken, or a proportion of pork or goat or lamb, and many more grains. And of course you would have dairy, cheese, eggs, and so on. So we also put together a Western diet for 1,000 people a year, and express that, as with the other one, in per person volumes as well, because people were particularly interested in those. Okay, but the other thing that people really wanted to know is, okay, we're going to have an independent food sovereign system here in Alert Bay. Please tell us what it makes sense to do from a cost and doability point of view. And cost really comes down to things like all of the gear you need to procure food locally, the labor, the maintenance, the storage, and so on. And in order to do that for a traditional diet, you have to sort of get some sense of what it would take to capture food and country meats and harvesting vegetables, seaweed, and so on locally. And of course, if you ask a hunter, you ask a harvester, you ask anyone, what's a good fishing trip look like, or what's a good hunting trip like? They'll say, of course, it depends. I mean, and it depends that, a really good fishing or hunting trip, for instance, people would say, well, you might go out for a day. It might only cost you $200 and pick up and gas and ferry and food for the day and a little bit of labor to help, but you might come home with 2 elk. Now that would be a very good hunting day. And they'd say, well, a terrible hunting day when you're out there for 7 days, there's 4 of you, it costs you $500 for food and gas and ferry fees just to go hunting, and you come home with 1 elk and a couple of deer and some grouse. You can see here that elk is always the prized food. Or similarly with fishing, on a really good day, you might come back with 300 fish, and on a moderate day, you might come back with half that many, and on a bad day, you come back with no fish at all. So there's huge variation in what can reasonably be procured in the normal means of harvesting. And so how did that look in cost? Well, it looked fairly astounding at first. So for instance, if we were going to provide that traditional diet to 1,000 people, they really needed to have a few things in place. And they needed, we estimated, with their help, about 50 trucks, because, most foods are seasonable and you need to go out in a large number of vehicles to get what you need for the year. Or you might need about 50 small boats, maybe 6 gill netters, so there's popular fishing boats that can get into most of the waters, and maybe just 2 or 3 seine boats, which are the larger boats used for salmon fishing. And of course, it costs a lot to procure these boats and trucks. In fact, we called this project at one point 2 boats and a pickup truck, and it might cost quite a bit to maintain them. And you also have these variable costs in the form of crossing to the island on the ferry or to other parts of their territory. Or gas, of course, is very expensive, and maintenance is very expensive. So in the end, that came to quite a bit of money. For instance, we were looking at about $200,000 for just the smaller boats and the pickup trucks, and about $150,000 for maintaining seine boats over years. They last 40 to 50 years, 50 often, and about $50,000 for the gill netter fleet. So at first glance, it seemed like an astounding amount of cost for 1,000 people and becoming food sovereign. However, when we broke this down into what it would cost to buy those foods locally or to harvest them locally, based on those cost estimates that I just showed you, it was quite a different picture. So if you look at the red bars, that's the cost of buying the same food locally. So that's either on the grocery store that's on the island, which is often fairly thinly stocked, or going across on the ferry to Vancouver Island proper and going to the better inventoried grocery store there where food is also cheaper. So using the cheapest forms of procuring those foods in those 2 places, we found that it was vastly more expensive to buy most of the important traditional foods locally rather than harvesting them. So for instance, even with seine boats, even with failed fishing journeys or poor hunting journeys, it was still about $20 to $1 for the cost of procuring salmon, even keeping into the cost equation the boats, the labor, the ferry cost, the maintenance, etc. Or it came to about $20, or rather about $2.50 per $20 than it might cost to get the shrimp and prawn supply. So overall, the take-home message here is that it was vastly cheaper to harvest locally than to purchase locally, and that was especially true for salmons, for halibut, for mollusks and mussels. Definitely true for shrimp and prawns, and almost also very true for things like berries. So despite those initial large cost estimates, dividing that out per food, per person annually, provided a very different portrait. In essence, we did the same thing for vegetable production. So, there isn't a lot of agroecological knowledge, extension services, et cetera, in this part of the province, but we do have something called Jevons plots, which are well known, and this is what it takes to produce certain pounds of vegetable per year in 100 square foot plots. So very doable. You could have these in backyards, you could have them in community space, and this is the estimate, which you don't want to look at too carefully, but just to note that there are a lot of uncertainty in these estimates too. So if you look at, celery, which is about 9 items down, On a good year, you might produce something like 450 pounds, but in a bad year it might be 250, and in a really great year it might be 800 pounds. So lots of variability in these that we had to deal with. And costs looked different. We had equipment costs, but that wasn't expensive. You had a lot of labor costs. You had input costs, so we assumed composts and fairly sustainable agricultural practices. And you end up with certain costs per unit of different things. So just to give you an idea, producing nuts was extremely expensive per unit cost at just over $20, same with grains, but a lot cheaper to produce some local berries or some green perennial vegetables or even some milk. We again took that and looked at purchasing locally and producing locally, and in this case the blue bars again are producing locally, the red bars are purchasing locally. And by and large, it is more expensive to purchase locally than to produce locally, even for a very uncertain food system in a part of the province where things don't go very well. So there's a lot of work that would have to go into making that system viable, but just from a cost point of view, it's doable, even in a part of the province where food production is quite expensive and fairly uncertain. Okay, last puzzle. Last puzzle was we have this current reality and we have an aspirational one in the face of environmental change, especially climate change. So the other big question is, what are people getting locally and what's the likely future from a climate point of view? And without going on too long here, I just want to say a couple of things about this. Of course, a lot of the climate models are global climate models, so adapting them to local conditions is a little difficult, but there is some data on this. And so what this basically says is if we take these diets seriously, so let's look for now at the traditional diet vis-a-vis marine foods, what are people actually getting? So what does the law allow them to get as compared to what they might need in a kind of traditional diet sense? What's climate change doing to those foods? And what's the direction of that change? So in the left-hand column here, second column, is the percent to which the needs as defined by the traditional diet that we have put together here with some historical references and a reasonable but conservative approach to that diet. Well, they're underserved in sockeye by about 70%, and they're underserved in the other salmonids by 75 to about 90+%. They get less than 1% of the crabs needed relative to the record on annual harvesting across a 10-year period, and less than 1% of, say, clams and mollusks needed. So they're getting a very small proportion of what might be considered a traditional diet, even though the rights are ostensibly in place to access that diet or procure that diet. And that often happens as a function of negotiations between nations and the Department of Fisheries as to their annual allocation. And often they're off by many orders of magnitude as to what need is, but there hasn't been necessarily a calculation of quote unquote need, although this one has since been used successfully to argue for better allocation of fish. In the climate effects scenario, we looked at all kinds of models and estimates of climate projections on key marine foods, and most of these are expected to go down, and they're going down fairly dramatically some years. So for instance, the availability of sockeye in this part of British Columbia is expected to decrease by 10 to 20% in the coming period, so the next 20 to 25 years. And that scenario looks pretty similar. It's very dire for herring in particular, where the projection is that at least half of the herring conventionally available will be reduced. And the only thing that is really going up or in the scenario is possibly halibut, because halibut stocks have been moving into the area from below the Canada-US border. So there's some hope about halibut, but it's not nearly as prized a fish as is as are salmonids. Some uncertainty around pink shrimps, which are eaten. Same with crab. The chain seems to be fairly neutral. Same with rockfish. These are very local fish. On clams, it's harder to estimate, but it is assumed that the trend will be negative. So the other thing going on here is that the available food is much less than might be reasonable as some kind of approximation of a traditional diet. The climate effects are fairly severe, and these are probably quite conservative overall. The direction for most of these foods is negative, with a few possible exceptions that are either neutral or positive, shrimp or halibut. So it isn't a terrific picture, but at least it's a clearer one with regard to what it makes sense to do or not do moving forward. And I think that thinking quite prosaically in these terms and trying to take on these historical debates about what's enough fish and contemporary debates about what's going to happen to traditional foods is a non-trivial problem and really important to lots of nations. So moving on from here, what does all this mean? Well, again, salmon allocations are well below most years, but on a really good year might come somewhere within 30 to 40% of need. The rest are in quite bad shape. And there are other kinds of concerns. There are fishing family and non-fishing families, so spreading this skill set around to larger numbers to make a system sovereign system doable is still a big effort. Food processing itself is quite controversial. People tend to like to process or can salmon, for instance, in family groups. They know who they prefer to trust in that canning process. And then there are larger pictures, like the contaminant loads in some foods. If they are going to eat a sovereign diet, what kind of trade-offs are involved there. In any case, that's the end of the webinar for today. Moving forward, we're trying to look more carefully at fuller ranges of foods and the uncertainties around them. We're trying to look at more iterations of the diet, and we're trying to look at a larger suite of impacts on key foods and not the ones we just started to think about here. This is a picture of seaweed drying in the spring a few years ago. Thanks very much for your interest and time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Bye-bye.